Hello, welcome to the news with me, Chris Bennett, and Alan Noonan. Our first story tonight, HMV. The debt of HMV has been purchased by Hilco UK, the firm behind HMV Canada and the rescue of Habitat. This hopefully will give time for the administrators Deloitte to secure the future of the near 100-year-old store. Suppliers, including names along with Sony, Universal Music, are in favour and may cut DVD and CD prices, offering easy credit as well to maintain their position with the store on the high street. The Lily May donation has been honoured, gift cards are now being accepted, and hopefully the firm may be saved.
This is good news anyway for the staff, whose sit-in seems to have paid off.
Yeah, it's a nice thing, certainly for them. And now there is some uncertainty around the staff, whether or not their jobs will be secure, whether or not the restructuring will have the same form as before, is obviously not, is on the cards.
That's a good point. I suppose security is a certainly limited word when it comes to this.
It certainly is, but it's definitely we're going in the right direction with this. It's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely, a positive development. Yeah. Kerry County Council, where Danny Healy-Rae, an independent councillor, proposed a motion which would ideally create a permit allowing drinkers in rural area to drive after, and this is within the proposal itself, 2 or 3 drinks on little used roads, driving at very low speeds. Now the proposal is aimed at what Danny Healy-Rae said would restore a bit of social activity in local pubs and may help prevent suicide and depression. Now Danny Healy-Rae, it must be said, is a publican, and 3 of the 5 councillors who voted in favour of the amendment, or the proposal, which is carried and now goes before Minister for Justice Alan Shatter, were also publicans. 3 people voted against it, while the rest of the council were in absentia. So, a little bit of an interesting message there from Kerry County Council. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, it's an interesting one there. The point that grabbed me initially was the point that he was making about this sort of cutting suicide. But what he's saying is essentially, alcoholism's okay as long as you don't do it in the comfort of your own home. Take it to the pub and then drive home. And as I was watching, I was looking on our website when the story went up in terms of the comments, one was brilliantly made that whilst the statistics show essentially that people having a drink, for instance, in the comfort of their own home, that can potentially lead to suicide, that kind of thing. Those who drink and then go out onto the roads essentially can kill other people, not just themselves.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Chris. And there was something as well, of course, all the people have come out raging against this proposal, which, obviously is fairly ludicrous considering the movement towards, or movement against drink driving. Labour councillor Gillian Wharton-Slattery said that depression causes suicide. It's not caused by being able to go to the pub. There's more things in Kilgarvan than to go into your pub. But like you said, it's actually a bit more balanced than that. Loneliness does contribute to the depression that is so prevalent in rural constituencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got no problem with rural constituents essentially going to the local pub to get more of that community spirit. I've got no problem with that. But the idea that to lure them or to bring them to the pubs, they need to be able to drink and then drive home seems absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, essentially, when you look at the proposals, if I was to drive from our studio back down to Cork, but on quiet roads and driving a tractor at less than 30 miles an hour, I could have had 3 or 4 pints by now.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes absolutely no sense to me, and hopefully it will be slapped down as quick as it was proposed.
Yeah, just to give a final bit of context on this story, the road deaths fatalities have dropped significantly in Ireland and throughout the rest of Europe in the last 10 years. 161 road deaths in Ireland in 2012. That's the lowest ever since road records began. And in comparison, there were 365 in 2006. So obviously this anti-drink driving campaign has really paid off. It contributes towards this.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that things like this just undermine all the good work that's been put out there already. Moving on to our third story of the night. Paul Begley, who was jailed last year after pleading guilty to evading import tax on 1,000 tons of Chinese garlic by marking it as apples, has had his jail term thrown out today by the Court of Criminal Appeals. Now, they've claimed that an error in principle had taken place and that mitigating circumstances, including the admission of his guilt and a €1.6 million repayment plan, had not been taken into account in the original decision. He will be resentenced sentenced on the 4th of February, but he currently is still in custody until that further decision is made. It's an interesting case, Alan, and I suppose the most interesting point that came out of it was that garlic actually carries a 232% import tax on it, compared to 9% for other fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, it seems like the garlic is highly protected in the Irish market.
Highly protected. Not quite sure where this protectionism comes from. I mean, you know, you think to yourself, I mean, the court suggested that it was essentially naked profiteering sort of by Mr. Begley on this, or alleged profiteering. I would say perhaps maybe he's highlighting a real problem here, that there is a strange discrepancy within the import duties.
That's a really interesting point, Chris. I hadn't really thought of it that way, and I must actually admit that when you have taxation that is so prohibitive on certain goods, you obviously encourage the black market, and this is exactly what that is in effect.
Yeah, I mean, whilst I'm not vaguely, you know, suggesting that he is some form of freedom fighter exposing this sort of thing, you know, the argument can be made.
Yeah, certainly. At least it definitely is bringing attention towards that. Right?
Yeah, exactly, and hopefully we will see, now that this has been brought to light, we will see some form of investigation into why there is a protectionism racket essentially surrounding garlic in this country.
Yeah, and what other goods does it exist for?
Absolutely.
Moving on towards Asia, and this is related to the dispute between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands. There's been a lot of tension there recently between the two countries, and adding his opinion to what exactly is going on, Chinese Colonel Lu Mingfu, no, that's not a joke, that's his name, he urged Australia to remain the kind-hearted lamb to China, and in effect not to choose the US and Japan if war did break out between China and Japan. He further added that America is the global tiger and Japan is Asia's wolf, and both are now madly biting China. Of all the animals, the Chinese people hate the wolf most. Australia should never play the jackal for the tiger or dance with the wolf. Rather deep metaphors there.
Yeah, I mean, one could call it mad, but on the other hand, one could call it absolutely inspired. It certainly highlights the issue there. I mean, essentially, it's a scrap over a couple of disputed islands which have no real significance economically, you know, politically, a huge significance.
Well, they were never a major disputed zone until the late 1970s, when suddenly, there were oil, the possibility of oil deposits found near the islands, and so this is kind of feeding in to the whole territorial nationalism that is building up between the two countries. Yeah,
it's a fantastically interesting situation. I suppose one of the hot points within that sort of sphere within the sort of Southeast Asia sphere of influence, essentially, you know, North Korea, the islands there, and that kind of thing. But I can't particularly see anything coming from this, rather than a bit of saber rattling on both sides.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. Certainly I hope that nothing happens, but you have such wars, dare I say, have started over even more ridiculous things. You'd certainly hope that cooler heads prevail, because this would be, the islands are uninhabited themselves, and they were recently bought by the Japanese government from a Japanese businessman who had owned them beforehand, but it would seem to be preposterous to start a war over.
But then I suppose, you know, sides are hardening. You know, Japan has a slightly, you know, more right-wing government in power at the moment. You know, China is hardening its sort of, let's say, acting its position, you know, pushing its enterprise really in that area, and Australia would be key to that, being a huge trading partner for both Japan and China.
Yeah, China definitely feels like it's on the rise, and one of the other things that Lu Mingfu said as well was that American hegemony is not at its dawn and not at its zenith, it's at its sunset, and night is coming. Now those are slightly ominous words.
Ominous, strong words. Whether or not the party, the Chinese party will fully back them, I suspect it's not, but it's certainly interesting to see that there is that sort of harsh terms.
Well, the one thing that is interesting about this story is that Lu Mingfu is actually an author, and his books had been banned, or at least some of them have been prohibited, but that prohibition has been lifted by the Chinese government very recently, and I'm not sure what way that contributes.
So now, you know, let's just say before he may have been slightly mad, but now he's a good kind of mad.
Exactly.
To roll out for the right kind of thing. We're going to move on now. Arlene Foster, the Enterprise Minister for the DUP, has suggested today that the Unionists might support Sinn Féin's calls for the border poll and essentially call their bluff. Mrs Foster said a poll would expose fantasy politics of Sinn Féin and was confident of a majority for the union should a referendum take place. Interesting stuff here. The sort of theme of this was the Unionists coming out and saying to Sinn Féin, and obviously from Gerry Adams pushing the idea of a border poll and a referendum on the future of Northern Ireland, saying be careful what you wish for.
Sure, absolutely. And it seems that the thing that the people looking on at this sort of squabble between the DUP and Sinn Féin over the idea of a border poll would be worried that any sort of poll might lead to a hardening between the two sides, both nationalist and unionist, because the whole, I suppose, great thing about since the Good Friday Agreement has been that both sides have been so conciliatory towards one another and working with one another in what effectively has been a Northern Irish government.
That's right. I mean, Mitchell McLaughlin of Sinn Féin actually came on today in reaction to the comments of Mrs Foster and said that the DUP approach was refreshing and that Sinn Féin would accept and respect the outcome of any referendum. But then one has to go back to that and think, if a referendum were to take place, and let's hypothetically say that the Unionists were to win, I would suggest it may be debatable as to how far that acceptance and respect would go further down the line if there was a referendum saying that the Unionists, the union was what people wanted.
But I think it's almost a win-win for Sinn Féin. Even if they lose, all they get is the status quo. The days are gone when Northern Ireland doesn't have a devolved assembly. I mean, they will never go back to the days where they are ruled from London. So effectively, they're gotten to the point of devolution, and I think they realise that if they keep pushing this idea of independence, even if they lose this upcoming border poll, well, they can always try again in 10 or 20 years. I think for this, Sinn Féin is probably looking long term.
The tactics are excellent, and I suppose if parallels essentially can be drawn to the votes on Scottish independence and the policies of the SNP out in the cold for many years, bided their time, put the policies in place, got the arguments ready, and now are actually sort of pushing quite consistently for a poll which may give Scottish independence. I think you're right in saying that Sinn Féin's tactics are potentially going that way. I suspect they've probably learned a lot from the SNP.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only agree with you on what the SNP have done. They've been extremely astute in positioning themselves and positioning the debate with regard to Scottish independence. Something that is basically would have been unimaginable 10 years ago even.
Yeah, I mean, especially if something like a referendum has to essentially stay on the books, shall we say, then there's absolutely no problem to repeatedly roll it out every 10, as you say, every 10, 20 years and hope for the result to be, completely different.
And actually, one of the things that I might add to this story, Chris, is that if Scotland does vote for independence, the question will be how can Northern Ireland remain in a Britain that is effectively already falling apart, that is no longer a united kingdom as such.
It'll be an interesting one, and I suspect it's one for 2014 to really
Absolutely.
see on that. We've got a tumultuous year, I suspect. Then, our final story of the night is a rather interesting one. Stephen Locke has been cleared of assault causing bodily harm after he whipped a woman with a length of rope in a 50 Shades of Grey inspired sex game. Yes, a court in Ipswich delivered a not guilty verdict for Mr. Locke after a relationship, a sadomasochistic relationship I may add, he had with a woman involving group sex, bondage, and apparently the woman tattooing property of Stephen Locke on her genitalia took place. In August, Mr. Locke tied the woman to the floor like a dog and whipped her repeatedly, causing bruising to the buttocks. Mr. Locke repeatedly said in the court case that this was a game between two consenting adults, and he kind of had a point here. Apparently the woman in question had signed a contract allowing Mr. Locke possession of her body, and if she broke the rules he was allowed to whip her. They had a code word which was red, which she apparently did not use throughout the whipping session, and she actually had sex with him afterwards. So it couldn't have hurt that much. The prosecution idea that they put forward was that she thought that this was all fantasy, and that she got more than she bargained for. But looking back on this, in the fact that, you know, she's got a tattoo of his name on her genitalia, that she's engaged in everything else that they've done, I'm pretty sure she'd be rather stupendously naive to be thinking that it's fantasy.
Yeah, I think she definitely, I'm kind of amazed that she took the case after having his name on her genitalia, etc., etc.
Yeah,
and the contract as well is kind of, you know.
I know, I mean, the love contract was signed, you know, it was there in black and white, or however it was put across. The interesting thing to me is to see whether or not this case will set precedent, and we will see more of a 50 Shades of Grey type case move as the net curtains draw back and more of the seedy side of suburbia comes out.
Have you read the book yourself?
No, I have not.
Okay.
No, I have refrained so far, but it seems like a good read if it inspires that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've also restrained myself from reading the book. But
yeah, we have a show coming up tonight, I believe at 10 o'clock, with Alan and myself, and a guest from Sinn Fein, I believe.
Yeah,
Young Sinn Fein.
Young Sinn Fein, and so we'll be talking about young people in politics, and also dealing with Sinn Fein and some of the issues around the border issue, and Gerry Adams is leader of Sinn Fein later on, so let's look forward to 10 o'clock.
Check that out at 10 o'clock. This has been the news at 7.